It began in 1806, 1 year after Lord Nelson's cannons silenced Trafalgar. Far from the European waters, another storm was brewing in the forests of West Africa. 3 Asante chiefdoms, proud but subdued, lived under the shadow of Ashanti's authority and law. In Asante Apimenim, a sacred shrine was discovered. The grove of Arroyo, newly laid to rest within Nana Amadai's jurisdiction, had been violated. Golden ritual treasures meant to guide the spirit into the ancestral world were gone. The offender was no stranger. He was a relative of the chief of Asante Atendanso. Bound by custom, Nana Amadai did not act rash. He reported the desecration to Nana Aputai, the culprit's relative, one of the 2 chiefs of Asante Atendanso, alongside Nana Kojotibu. This was no ordinary theft. It was an offense against lineage, law, and the ancestors themselves. And once such a matter crossed chiefdom lines, it could no longer remain an Asante affair alone. The offended chief, bound by honor but restrained by Asante sovereignty, did not take vengeance into his own hands. He did what civilization demanded. He appealed to the administrative capital of Asante, Kumasi, to King Osei Tutu Kwamina Asibe, the gold stool's guardian and arbiter of law among men and spirits. After due deliberation, the king's judgment was clear. Aputai must make restitution, for in Asante law, to rob the dead was to invite a curse upon the living. He agreed to the judgment, only to return to his jurisdiction and resort to his arrogance and refusal. Worse still, he turned his defiance into violence, sending his warriors to attack the very chief he had wronged. In Asante, defiance of the throne was no mere rebellion. It was spiritual treason. And so, King Osei Asibe sent envoys, men of peace, draped in golden regalia. Symbols so sacred that to harm them was to spit in the face of the king, his royal court, and the ancestors themselves. But Aputai did the unthinkable. He killed the envoys, mutilated their bodies, and hanged them like trophies from trees that marked the Asante frontier. The nerve. To Kumasi, this was no longer a dispute. It was an abomination. By Asante law, the killing of envoys was the declaration of war. The Asante rose from his stool. He gathered his generals, summoned the war drums, and marched with thunder in his wake. His army easily crushed Aputai's forces, scattering the rebels like dust in Harmattan winds. Defeated and disgraced, Aputai fled south, with another rebellious Asante chief, Tibu, seeking sanctuary under the Fantis, not knowing that his crime had just lit the match that would burn into one of the greatest wars the Gold Coast had ever seen. By every measure of power, the war could have ended there. The Asante army was more than capable of crushing the numerous yet militarily unprepared Fantis. But the Asante chose restraint, not weakness, restraint. Instead of unleashing war, he sent royal diplomats once more. Men wrapped in authority and peace, bearing a simple demand: return the fugitives, restore harmony, affirm goodwill towards Kumasi. And to make his intentions unmistakably clear, the king sent gifts worthy of royalty: gold that shimmered with goodwill, a magnificent silk umbrella of state, and slaves to serve as symbols of reconciliation, not submission. This was not conquest. This was diplomacy at its highest expression. But before the Fanti chiefs could properly respond, Aputai and Kojotibu did what fugitives often do. They ran again further south, deeper into Abra, firmly within Fanti territory, where the Fanti Confederation was in session, gathered in council. The Fanti kings and chiefs, acting on bad intelligence, misjudged what stood before them. They underestimated Asante's war prowess. They loathed the Asante state. They dismissed it as crude, uncivilized, a forest power unworthy of fear or respect. Besides, they figured their contact with Europeans offered them an advantage in terms of weaponry. They couldn't have been further from the truth. Therefore, instead of weighing judgment, they harbored the fugitives. Still, the Asante did not abandon law. Word was sent, not with threats, not with drums of war, but with reason. The message was clear: return the offenders. There was no cause for war between the Fantis and the Asantes. There was still a path back from the edge. But the Fanti kings and chiefs chose out. The message of defiance was unmistakable. The envoys were decapitated. Their heads were placed deliberately along the very road the Asante army would one day march. Taking it a step further, their mouths were desecrated, stuffed with feces. Talk about an ancient way of telling somebody you ain't ish. A message not just of refusal, but of humiliation. This was no longer insult. It was ritualized contempt. It was total desecration. What lay on that road was not merely bodies. It was the end of diplomacy. In that moment, the Fanti kings and chiefs did not merely reject Kumasi. They declared themselves ready for the consequences. The king's restraint had reached its limit. Law had spoken, and it had been answered with blood. The enraged war drum spoke again. Osei Kwame Nasibe, thoroughly enraged, ordered the army forward. The Asante army marched into Abra. The Fanti Confederation, who had been so confident in council, collapsed almost immediately in combat. Their resistance dissolved under disciplined force. Once again, Apatai and Kojotibu fled. This time to Anamabo, about 10 miles east of Cape Coast, where British flag and stone walls of Fort Anamabo promised safety. They pursued them relentlessly. They stopped at Kromanti and were received by the Dutch, who even offered Fort Amsterdam as the army's garrison. Over in Cape Coast Castle, the British headquarters, Governor George Torrane, colonel by honorary title, not by battlefield experience, promised asylum to the fugitives. He spoke confidently, even grandly, claiming he would protect the fugitives and the Fanti allies at Fort Anamabo, even against what he called force of arms. But then the message arrived. A large Asante army was on the march, and Torrane's courage shrank inside his Cape Coast castle walls. The fort of Anamabo was old but strong, high thick walls with 12 cannons. But Torrane had barely 20 British defenders to rely on. And he had no faith in the Fanti army, whom he considered undisciplined and unreliable, to defend themselves, much less support the British. To stop the Asante from coming to Cape Coast, he attempted a truce. He sent a white flag to the Asante, but even that was sabotage, because Torrane's Fanti allies, arrogant despite their weakness, refused to let the truce proceed. And then the battle came. Stone walls, European guns, foreign flags. But to the Asante army, nothing was insurmountable, and so they attacked. Fanti soldiers scattered. One British observer said, "They fled like sheep." Really? Did he have to put it like that? Outside the fort walls, thousands who were trying to flee by sea were overtaken on the beach and slaughtered. Inside Fort Anamabo, 2,000 refugees were admitted. Terrified women, children, villagers from nearby settlements. Thousands more will press themselves against the fort stone walls, thinking cannon and musket fire will frighten the Asantes away. They dared the guns. British fire killed Asante by the hundreds, and yet the Asante slaughtered refugees huddled beneath the walls anyway. A grim proof that fear had changed sides. Furious that the white men were firing at his troops, the Asante commander ordered the fort to be taken. Twice they charged the main gate. Twice they failed. The British fired so relentlessly their shoulders bruised from the recoil. Still the Asante charged again, this time led by a man carrying a massive flame torch, a living battering ram of fire. As he neared the gate, he was shot dead. He fell upon the torch, smothering it beneath his body. The gate held. At sunset, the Asantes withdrew. For 6 hours, they had fought cannons and muskets at close range. Some British defenders fired 300 shots. At that distance, missing was almost impossible. For more than a mile, the beach was littered with bodies, Asante and Fanti, and the shore above the tide line stained red. The Asantes charged in an offense formation that each blast of grape shot killed 20 to 30 men at once. What is a grape shot? Iron balls packed together like a cluster of grapes, fired from the cannon's mouth, exploding outward in a wide cone of death, turning one shot into a storm of flying metal, ripping through ranks like a giant shotgun. It's a shame they compare it to grapes, because there's nothing pleasant about it. The Asante later said he lost 3,000 men. The shaking Touraine admitted the Asantes fought with a bravery not to be exceeded. Then came the truce. And here is where the story turns sharp. During the truce, the Asante allowed the British to reinforce the fort by sea, a gesture of confidence, not kindness. Touraine sent emissaries to the Asante king. He received them courteously and sent them back with a message of his own, insisting nothing to be settled until Touraine meets me face to face. And Touraine agreed. He traveled from Cape Coast to Anamabo to negotiate peace with Asante, and to impress the king, to show usefulness, to show obedience. Touraine ordered the seizure of the 2 Asin fugitive chiefs to whom he had personally promised protection. The slippery Apotai escaped, but the other, the blind and old Cebu, not so lucky, was delivered to Asante hands. Dressed in their sweat-stained scarlet uniforms, Touraine and a handful of British officers who accompanied him to the Asante camp were cowed by the size and grandeur of the Ashanti delegation. Touraine was received by many guards, elegantly dressed in silk and ornamented with gold, who were seated under large umbrellas and attended by hundreds of servants. Among them, a tall athletic Arab officer from somewhere north of Timbuktu, his men using muskets and bows. Their barbed iron arrows later found lodged in the fort. Why they fought beside Asante, no one could explain. Many British officers felt dishonored by the treachery of Touraine, but King Oseasibe was pleased because he handed over Cebu. He also offered up all the coastal belt forts and castles to the Asante. Handing over the title signified payments of tributes too. Then came the king's demand. The refugees inside the fort, all 2,000, were to be handed over as slaves. Touraine did not refuse. Instead, he bargained to be allowed to keep 1,000 for himself. The king agreed, and to the amazement and horror of the British officers, Touraine did not protect the people. The very people who had run to the fort for protection were seized at Anamabo, claimed as property, and sold into slavery. King Oseasibe would later say to a British visitor, "I took the English for my friends because I saw their object was trade only, and they did not care for the people." Touraine, drowning in debt, sold his share to a slave dealer who shipped them to the Americas. But Cape Coast returns back to the story because that is when accountability tries to breathe a bit. When John Swansea, the commandant of Fort James in Accra, heard what Touraine had done, he rose from his malaria bed, fever and all, and made a brutal canoe journey to Cape Coast, the British headquarters, to confront Touraine directly and hopefully stop the sale of the Fanti citizens. He arrived a little too late to stop the main shipment. All he could do was shame Touraine for his treachery. Then the strain finished what fever began. Swansea died in Cape Coast shortly after arriving in October 1807. To the coastal people and the Asantes alike, Touraine's actions meant one thing. Britain had admitted Asante supremacy. The British would later learn how close the fort had come to falling anyway. That just before the truce, the Asante commander had ordered thousands to maintain constant musket fire, while thousands more brought enough gunpowder to breach the gates. Had the final attack gone forward, Fort Anumabo would almost certainly have fallen. Therefore, nothing between 1807 and 1817 would weaken Asante conviction that they were the supreme military power of the Gold Coast. After this, the Asantehene turned his gaze east, toward Accra. No Fanti army rose to meet him. No war drums answered his march. The road opened, and at Winnipeg, Nana Osei Tutu Kwamina Asante walked past the gathered people, past the drums, silenced fear. He stepped forward into the waiting sea, and let the waves take his legs. Let the sword touch his skin, not as a challenge, but as a question. He turned to the people of Winnipeg and asked, "Who rules these waters?" They answered with a name older than the forts and flags, a name the ocean itself understands. Bonsu, the Fanti word for whale. Then he spoke, not to boast, but with finality. He had conquered the land, and now he stood on a post before the sea. And in that moment, the name found him, not given lightly, not spoken casually. Bonsu, a being no shore can contain, a force whose movement reshapes kingdoms, a presence that does not ask permission of tides. From that day, he was no longer only a man of war. He became a force of nature. Asantehene Nana Osei Bonsu. My name is Jete, Papa Jete. Welcome to the Qulture Hub, where Q stands for quintessential. If you're enjoying the journey, please do me a favor, hit the subscribe, your bell notification. Please do good to leave a comment, a like, and share. We promise to do all that we can to make this journey worth it. And remember, you are royalty, so keep it cultured.